Salam and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. This event, Silence Voices, is put together by the Amnesty International Palestine Action Team, which was formed back in November of last year to address the human rights violations against people of Palestine. Amnesty International Vancouver has a long history of hosting and co-hosting events to spread awareness about human rights issues around the world. Yet today's session, Silenced Voices, is the first event put together to shed light on freedom of expression amid the genocide in Gaza. This event is happening in collaboration with Free Palestine Tri-Cities BC. We acknowledge that we are meeting this evening on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. We acknowledge that they, along all the other Indigenous nations across Turtle Island, from coast to coast to coast, are the original caretakers of this land. We live, meet, and work on lands that for thousands of years have been inhabited and cared for by Indigenous peoples. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work on these lands, and by doing so, we give our respect to its first inhabitants. Some housekeeping items in respect of the two speakers and the audience. Please silence your phones. No recording of any kind is allowed for the session. You have cue cards and pens for you to write your questions down as they arise during the talks. We will collect those cards during the Q&A time. If any disruption happens for any reason, we have a safety team that will take care of it. As we are witnessing the aftermath of the genocide in Gaza unfolds,
and the accelerated aggression in the West Bank, we're also witnessing the continuation of the suppression of the Palestinian narrative and the Palestinian perspective. This suppression took many forms throughout the past decades, whether it was surveillance of people of Palestine, monitoring their social media or their communication platforms. Also, it took the form of murdering Palestinian journalists who cover the injustices on the ground in Palestine, like the murder of Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh in May 2022. And in the past 16 months, it didn't get any better. Among the 10,000s of people that the Zionist entity managed to murder, there were 205 journalists who were murdered in Gaza. And the suppression took also other forms, like just in few days ago, there was an attack on one of the bookstores in East Jerusalem. The owners were arrested and the Palestine books were confiscated. On the Zionist pages, they blasted it out that the bookstore and the books that they are selling are promoting the murder of Jews. And ironically, the irony is many of those books were written by Jewish authors and Jewish historians, including Ilan Pappé and Noam Chomsky. But is this suppression of the Palestinian narrative only taking place in historic Palestine, or is it happening in our midst as well? There is power in real-life stories, and we gathered a number of them that happened on Canadian soil to narrate to you as vignettes. Most of them took place right here in the Greater Vancouver area. Most of them happened in the past 16 months. One happened shortly before the time indicated. While we're aware that there are many other similar stories, but we picked those ones because the people who experienced them firsthand reported them to us. So sit back and relax for a few minutes of story time. Bake sale. In one of the post-secondary institutions in one of the neighboring provinces, there was a social justice class. A student announced to her class that she's doing a bake sale. All the proceeds, she decided, will go to feed the hungry and the starving children in Gaza. On that day, her instructor emailed all the students of that class saying that because of the bake sale on the assigned day, He didn't feel safe enough as a Jewish person to be on campus that day. He migrated that specific class to Zoom. The bake sale had barely any support. A contest. A 10th grade student in one of our local high schools participated in a spoken word contest, and bravely, the students won the first prize in their school for writing and performing a poem about the Palestinian human experience and identity. In the poem, there was no mention of Israel or any religion whatsoever. It was purely about the Palestinian human experience during the time of a genocide. The first winning students of each school throughout the district were supposed to meet at an assigned day and assigned school to perform their poems and celebrate their accomplishment by receiving their awards. The day before this big celebration, the student is called into the office and was told they cannot attend the celebration and they cannot read their poem because, quote unquote, it will make the Jewish students feel unsafe. The student was denied attending the ceremony. A sticker. A local educational assistant was disciplined by their principal for giving another teacher who was holding a Starbucks cup a small sticker that said boycott Israeli apartheid. A complaint was made to the principal. They were called into the office and was given a formal letter of expectations. Ukraine and the Palestine exception. A teacher in a local school, she was so inspired by the extra miles her school district went to support the people of Ukraine when they most needed it, and she thought they would do the same for Palestine. This teacher was so dismayed to see how Israel is using starvation as a weapon of war and seeing the settlers on the entrance of the Gaza Strip blocking the humanitarian trucks packed with food and damaging the contents. This teacher read on Human Rights Watch website that 32 people, including 28 children, had died of malnutrition and dehydration at hospitals in northern Gaza. So they advertised an invitation for other teachers to participate in a hunger strike for one day in solidarity with the starving children in Gaza. This teacher got disciplined and was told, quote unquote, there is no room for politics in our schools or social media. Public library. A community group was showing the occupation of the American mind at one of the local public libraries. A couple of Palestinian and Lebanese flags were displayed inside the room. A person who was part of a meeting in the room across saw the flags through the glass walls, looked so angry about the flags, made an effort to peek inside. They called another person who is known to agitate most of this community's groups' events. They showed up, and by all means possible, they tried to disrupt. Police were called, and the two agitators got escorted out. The event, both the screening and the panel, finished successfully, yet the next morning, the organizer of this community group receives a very formal email from the executive director of the library canceling their upcoming events that was supposed to be few weeks from that day and suspending the group from booking any further future events at the library. The group learned that Zionists have hailed the library with emails and phone calls protesting that such a movie, which they failed to name, was allowed to be screened in public libraries, claiming that the group screened images that disturbed some people that happened to be at the library that day, who spotted the scenes through the glass walls. The age range of the audience in the room that day were 14 years old to 84. None of them complained about the documentary. With a little research, the same documentary was actually found in that particular own library's database. This same library rated it grade 9 plus. However, the community group is still fighting this battle to gain their status back in the library. Palestine History Series. A local solidarity group organized a factual Palestine history series titled It Didn't Start on October 7th. They were offered a room in one of our local post-secondary institutions in the library. One of the registrants had different intentions, though. Once the address of the first session was shared the night before the first session, this registrant did not forward the email to any of the admins or the dean. Interestingly enough, this registrant emailed the information to the security team of that post-secondary institution. The content of the course wasn't in the email, yet the title itself, it didn't start on October 7th, was alarming enough for the security team to block the event because of safety issues. The series migrated to Zoom. Mainstream media. When South Africa presented their case against the Zionist entity before International Court of Justice, stating their points why Israel should be charged for committing a genocide, certain Canadian mainstream media outlets barely covered the South African oral argument. Yet the full Israeli defense to counter the claims was completely aired live to the Canadian public. Some journalists who work in some of those platforms reported that they are instructed not to use the term Palestine. One time one of those platforms actually did, and they had to make a public apology. But is that new? Our last story was reported by at the time, they were students, high school students. It was the school year of 2021-2022. This student at the time wrote a model United Nations committee for their high school club simulating the International Court of Justice and focusing on real case before the court. And the case was relocating of the United States Embassy to Jerusalem. The case was Palestine versus United States. They provided students participating in the conference with a background guide highlighting Palestinian history from credible historians like Rashid Khalidi and citing international law. Students engaged with the content in an incredibly respectful manner. They all provided positive feedback. Yet a parent of one of the students who was listening to the discussions and read the background guide emailed a complaint to the school and the superintendent of the school board that the guide on Palestinian history and committee content was anti-Semitic. The parent, in their complaint, also forwarded racist, anti-Palestinian, and Islamophobic remarks. The person who reported the story also added that the parent created an atmosphere of confusion, fear, repression among high school students simply interested in global issues and injustices. And my question is, are these stories just random incidents, or is there a bigger picture that we need to pay attention to? To help us answer this question, we have two amazing experts here with us tonight. And help me welcome Dr. Samir Gandisha, who is a prominent Canadian public intellectual and director of the Institute for the Humanities at Simon Fraser University. He is the author and editor of numerous books, most recently Spectres of Fascism, Historical, Theoretical, and International Perspectives. He writes regularly for Open Democracy, Canadian Dimension, Espace Art Actuel, Truth Out, Vancouver Sun, the Globe and Mail, and Los Angeles Review of Books. Let's welcome Dr. Samir Gandisha. Our next another amazing speaker, Dr. Coulter Lowers. He's an academic researcher focused on the diplomatic history of the Palestine question. His PhD dissertation under Ilan Pape, The Struggle for Palestinian Rights, the Palestinian Campaign for Self-Determination and Statehood at the United Nations, 1967 to 1989, shed new evidentiary light on the relationship between Palestinian popular struggle, diplomacy, and development of proposals for resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict under international auspices. Let's welcome Dr. Coulter Lowers. Our flow of the evening, Dr. Samir Gandisha will start for 40 minutes. He will share a bit of his expertise with us. We'll have 10 minutes, 15 minutes break, and then we'll listen to Dr. Coulter Lowers for another 35 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have 25 minutes of Q&A, a few minutes of closing remarks, and we'll have to leave the room at 9. So the floor is yours, Dr. Samir.
Thank you very much, Shida. I'm really delighted to be here this evening. I'm here not as an expert on Palestine as such, but Obviously, I'm paying attention to the region like most people are. I have an interest and some expertise in discussions of academic freedom and freedom of expression. That's something that I've been concerned with for decades now. So I think I might have some light to shed on those areas. In any case, I'll tell you a little bit about my background in a moment. So you can see in this title that I've tweaked it a little bit to include academic freedom because I think the university has been hit particularly hard, and the university is a very important institution for the pursuit of truth. The institution is not itself innocent by any means, but it is a space within which serious, critically rational discussions, evidence-based discussions can still happen. And as we know, in this particular moment in history, this has never been more important. So the university and academic freedom must be defended. Before I continue on, I would just first like to thank Amnesty for the kind invitation to be here. Also to Katrina for all of her help in organizing this and in her assistance in the logistics. Again, Gita, thank you very much for being a key organizer for this very, very important event. I would also like to acknowledge that this event is taking place on the unceded and occupied territories of the Coast Salish people, the Squamish, the Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Especially in an event like ours tonight. This is not an incidental land acknowledgement, but in fact is very much central to the content of our discussion because it is really about the kind of ongoing settler colonialism here in Canada. And it's also, of course, about the ongoing settler colonialism in Palestine. And we need to always keep that front and center. Here is a kind of rough outline of what I'm going to discuss. This is a bit about my background and interests. I'm going to be speaking also then about some of the programming we've done at the Institute for the Humanities over the last decade or so, and how we already, 10 years ago, had come across some difficulties within the university, certain faculty members pushing back on pro-Palestinian programming. Of course, post-October 7th, this is only accelerated and deepened. So I want to talk about that. I think the story time was so telling and so resonant with some of the things I'm going to talk about in terms of this what I call a fetishization of safety, and then a kind of response, which is securitization. Securitization of public space, securitization of various institutions, but especially the securitization of the university, which has a dampening and a chilling effect on academic freedom and freedom of expression. This, I think, can in large part be attributed to the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, of which most of you, if not all of you, are at least passingly familiar with. I want to go into it a little bit. And then my fifth point really will be to talk a little bit about this recent closure that's happened at SFU. Probably many of you have been to events that have been hosted or co-hosted, programmed, curated by the Vancity Office of Community Engagement, led by my very dear friend and comrade, Dr. Am Johal and his team. They've had a remarkable impact and incredibly positive and community building impact on this city for a university whose mission is engaging the world. And now that institution has been shuttered by the university. So I want to talk a little bit about that, and then finally draw some conclusions as to where we might want to stand on questions of academic freedom and free speech, freedom of expression. So just a little bit about me and my background. This is, in a sense, one of the many things I've learned from my Indigenous colleagues, students, friends, comrades, is it's always really important to sort of ground oneself, right? Where does one speak from? Right? As a political science professor from many decades ago said, where you sit often determines where you stand. Right? So it's important to figure out where one sits. And where I sit is really in a position or in a place that has been profoundly shaped by the experiences of colonialism, and that has really shaped the way I view the world. And one thing in particular that has impacted me is the way in which my family's experience in East Africa helped to illuminate the way I view the history of the 20th century. So my family left East Africa when I was an infant, so in the mid-60s, which of course, shows my age. But about 7-8 years later, my extended family from Uganda was expelled by the government of Idi Amin. He was really a dictator. Came to power in 71. The Asians were expelled in 72. It was this process of Africanization. So for a young person, this was profoundly impactful for me. When the discussions around the dinner table happened, it was really this event that was the one that really shaped the family's destiny. Right? So it had a huge impact. Around the same time, the made-for-TV series, The Holocaust, was being screened, and that led me always to identify with the history of the suffering and oppression of the Jewish people. I saw that in my own people's experiences of expulsion and exile, and no possibility of return. Does that also sound a bit familiar? And that, I think, shaped my interests. I developed an interest in 20th century critical theory and political thought. I was drawn to the Frankfurt School, drawn to the political theory of Hannah Arendt. As I came to know more about that experience in East Africa and Uganda, it also became clear that the State of Israel had a crucial role in the orchestration of the coup, which led Idi Amin to power. So already I have this sense of both, on the one hand, being profoundly influenced by and identifying with this historically oppressed people, right? Asians in East Africa or in Africa, throughout Africa, were referred to the Jews of Africa because we occupied a position as the kind of middleman in the economy, right? We were the merchants. And when there was an economic downturn, there was a lot of wrath directed at us, and it was racialized. So there were some interesting parallels there. But at the same time, our fate was determined by a state that played a very nefarious role in this country, right? So I'm always mindful of the split, of the difference between the two. And today, of course, there's a constant push to conflate the two. And I want to talk about this in terms of the IHRA definition in a few minutes. There's a constant tendency, as we know, to say that if you're critical of the state of Israel, you must be anti-Semitic. And I just think this is absolutely false, and I want to go into that in a few minutes. But it really did so shape my interest in the rise of fascism. I visited the UK in 1973, so the year after the coup, to see my dying grandfather. He was on his deathbed, and I was very fortunate to be able to go with my father to visit him for the first and last time before he passed away. And it was very palpable. I was 8 years old. It was palpable to me as a young boy how menacing the atmosphere was in the UK at this time, with the rise of the National Front and British National Party. Right? There was something going on. And so I've always been very interested in these sorts of socioeconomic crises on the one hand, and then the rise of the far right on the other, and the way in which fascism isn't a threat to democracy from outside of its interstices. Fascism emerges right from within liberal democracy. And that's something we have to obviously confront today, right? And this was something that Theodor Adorno, one of the figures, one of the philosophers that I work on, right? This very clear-eyed understanding that democracy is not the antithesis of fascism, or fascism doesn't emerge from outside of it, but rather from within its contradictions. So this also led me to co-edit a book with a fellow by the name of Lars Rensman, and this book came out in 2004, Arendt and Adorno, Philosophical and Political Investigations, or Political and Philosophical Investigations, which addressed the relationship between these two key figures of 20th century thought, two figures who really sought to come to terms with the origins and the legacy of the Holocaust. And they wrote about the Holocaust brilliantly. They wrote about the rise of fascism brilliantly. And Adorno in particular came up with a statement of its significance, which was that Hitler has given us a new categorical imperative, a new moral imperative. And that was to organize our thoughts and our actions in such a way that it didn't repeat itself. Now, he was clearly saying for everybody, not for those who suffered the most under the Nazis, right? That there's something about the way we have organized our social and economic and political relations that produces tendency towards fascism. And within that context, there are many different kinds of victims, as there were in the 20th century, as there were under the Nazis. And to prevent this from happening, we have to be very aware and very mindful of the multiplicity of victims, the multiplicity of enemies, right, of fascism. And I think this is really important to bear in mind, and perhaps we can come back to this in the discussion. So I want to fast forward now and talk about a couple of events that we, I suppose, had the temerity to host at the Institute. The one was we co-hosted a photo exhibition. It's not a great image, but you can see the title, Dispossessed but Defiant, which looked at the various realities of settler colonialism in the context of South Africa, of Canada, and, of course, of Israel. And I received a very strongly worded email from a colleague who identified what she thought were a number of inaccuracies in the exhibition and asked for us to never support anything like this ever again. Well, you can imagine what my response was. It was a tart one, to say the least. But I also said, this is a university, and you're welcome to point out inaccuracies or errors of interpretation or biases. Do that. Write a review, and then maybe something can be learned from this. But the idea is close it down. Close it down. Does that sound familiar? I think there are a lot of people on the left who've been arguing exactly for that. Cancel, close it down, trigger warnings, safe spaces. Not dreaming that in 100 years, anything like that would ever happen to the left. Well, I think we've learned a lesson, haven't we? Or maybe we should learn a lesson if we haven't. But the key thing here, and this resonates so much with what you were saying, Gita, the argument was this exhibition created an unsafe space for Jewish students. To my knowledge, there were no complaints. No complaints. But in the eyes of this one faculty member, this created an objectively unsafe space, right? And this person was receiving advice from a rabbi at Hillel House. It was very interesting. We would have this exchange. I would respond immediately to her queries or her arguments or worries, whatever. And then 3, 4, 5 days later, I think she would have consulted and then got back to me with her responses. Right? So it was fascinating. So again, this created an unsafe space for Jewish students. Again, we had so that was in 2015, I think, 2015, the photo exhibition. Fast forward about 5 years, I think it was January, February 2020, we had Laura and Stephen Shihai coming to discuss their very important book, Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, which was really an attempt to apply, if you will, or think through the lessons of Fanonian psychiatry and psychoanalysis in the context of the occupation. Very important contribution. I had the pleasure of appearing on a panel with them at the University of London a couple of months beforehand, and they said, "Oh, well, we're going to be," and this is an important point, so keep it in mind. "We're going to be in Vancouver in about a month or so." I said, "You're going to be in Vancouver? You must come to the Institute. We'll set a talk up." Fantastic. Let's do it. Okay, well, we did it. And it was almost comical. I'm sitting here like I am now. I'm in the process of introducing the speakers, and I'm mid-sentence, and all of a sudden, ping, an email. And so I finish introducing them, and once they start speaking, I look at the email. It's the rabbi from Hillel House saying, "You have organized an event that is anti-Semitic and has created an unsafe space for Jewish members of the SFU community." And this was then, it was emailed not just to me, but to the entire senior administration. So, of course, I had to reply all, and I took enormous pleasure in saying, well, perhaps next time you decide to criticize the content of a talk, you should wait for the talk to finish. And by the way, we have a number of members of the Jewish community here in the room. They don't look like they are feeling unsafe at all. And in fact, they're joining us for dinner after the talk is over. So it was a lot of fun to carefully word that email and send it off, and it would have then been on the through on the desk of the president, the provost, and other VPs. Bit embarrassing for this unfortunate soul. So this discourse of safety, which I've always been wary of. Right? I've always been extremely wary of the rank lack of safety in the discourse and practices of safe spaces. And I'll give you an example why first before I get into it. Is it's so arbitrary, right? And I think this is a theme that I'm going to come back to. It's a kind of arbitrary measure that has very little transparency and very little accountability. And how I know this, well, I know this because it's just simply the case. I've seen a lot of examples, but I saw an example in my own family. My daughter studied at OCAD-U, and she went with a friend of hers who's also a person of color to a safe space for BIPOC people, right? And she was unceremoniously asked to leave. Why? Because people had complained. They thought that she was not a member of the BIPOC community. And when her friend informed the organizer that, in fact, she was mixed race and should be able to stay, this person was very confused, and they just left. I think it puts those people who have to enforce these things in a very awkward position too. Well, now what do you do? These people have complained. Are they going to go back and argue with them and say, well, look, they're bona fide. They deserve to be here. Well, do you need a pass? Want to carry a pass around to show that you belong there? So I think there are a lot of problems with this intrinsically. But What I want to talk about is the way the discourse of safe spaces are not just the discourse, but the practices of establishing and maintaining and, let's say, policing safe spaces opens the door to securitization, exactly what you were also talking about, Gita. I mean, really, this introduction was amazing, precisely because what is now happening is a securitization of space at the university and beyond post-October 7th. In the last 18 months or so, I'm told I've been away from the university for a bit. I've been actually on sick leave for particular reasons I can't go into. But I had a very lively discussion with Adel Iskander. Many of you must also know him, who's the director of the Center for Comparative Muslim Studies. And there's been quite a chilling environment with respect to pro-Palestinian events in particular, but I think more generally, just public events. There's been a kind of weaponization of public health protocols, again, under the guise of safety, a new risk assessment protocol, which requires a minimum of 16-week lead time. And it's one individual who makes a decision, one individual. Not a committee where there's some deliberation, some rationality, some accountability. From what I can tell, I might be wrong on this, but from what I can tell, there's no concrete appeals process, right? So this is really top-down, authoritarian, anti-democratic governance. It goes against academic freedom, because academic freedom is democratic self-governance, autonomous self-governance, based on critical reason, critical rationality, giving and taking reasons and providing evidence, right? So this is a big problem. Getting back to my point about psychoanalysis under occupation, I doubt we would have been able to organize that, precisely because I don't think we would have had the 6 weeks in advance. And then psychoanalysis under occupation, that is probably not going to fly. I mean, that would be what I speculate. I don't know for sure. But it really is about ensuring that events that the university frowns upon happen only with a degree of struggle, but it's within their power to cancel them. And I think this is a big problem, and we need to push back on it. And I have been speaking to people about approaching the BC Civil Liberties Association to see what kind of a strategy we might be able to take up on this. So the other, and again, sort of very much resonant with what you were saying, Judith, the security personnel have been empowered to remove any signs and symbols of Palestinian existence, right? Existence. I mean, I think it is the fact that the being of Palestinians is some kind of an affront to the Zionist project, right? This seems to be what's going on. So keffiyehs have been taken down, flags have been taken down, and so on, right? It's within the rights of TAs, graduate students, faculty to display these symbols, isn't it? But not according to the security personnel. And also really telling, and I think this is setting up a context for further discussion that I'm going to get into, so pay attention to this as well. SFU has refused to publicize events that relate to Palestine, so to the Palestinian cause, say, pro-Palestinian solidarity. It's very important. So I think a lot of this flows from the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which the Vancouver City Council has adopted, as have many countries, many jurisdictions, many municipalities. And I think this is a big problem. I wanted to spend a little bit of time discussing this, but I had a very interesting and helpful discussion with Coulter just before we began. And you made the point that historically, Jewish organizations have been able to successfully struggle against a pervasive anti-Semitism in the United States without needing this kind of a definition Right? They've done very well, thank you. They've done well, thank you very much. And of course, the work of people like Hannah Arendt and Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, and others have provided the basis for very substantive understandings of anti-Semitism, historically grounded, sociologically informed, and very sympathetic, obviously, understandings of anti-Semitism. So why do we need this? I think that's a really good point. I would say, though, one can understand, with the undeniable rise of anti-Semitism, a certain impulse towards clarifying what it is. Let's just take that at face value. Fine. Okay, we don't subsume anti-Semitism beneath other forms of racism. Okay, why? I'm not exactly sure, but let's just be charitable and say, yes, okay, there's a felt need for this. And many of the dimensions of anti-Semitism seem not terribly objectionable. So let's say 1, 2, 3, fine. Let's take a look at 4. Accusing the Jews as a people, or Israel as a state, of inventing or exaggerating the Holocaust. Okay. Well, that's interesting, because this, number 4, right, has not stopped Israel from cozying up to actual neo-Nazis or post-fascists in Europe. For example, Marine Le Pen has said that Jews would be no safer in Europe than in France. She said that, right? Very explicitly. Yet her father said that the Holocaust was but a footnote to history. Similarly, the state of Israel is very friendly with a certain Viktor Orban, the was prime minister of Hungary. And this government, the Hungarian government, Orban's government, has enacted an explicitly anti-Semitic law. I think it sort of goes colloquially as the Soros law, right? So it's targeted this particular Jewish globalist, right? And that led to the expulsion of the European University, Soros's European University, the Hungarian campus, from the country. And that concerns us in a way. There's a Canadian connection, because Michael Ignatieff was heading the university at the time. I think he probably still is the head of that university. Israel has no problem with that. Is Israel itself anti-Semitic? That's confusing, isn't it? It's confusing. A little. You can at least be consistent. Apply those standards to yourself. Okay, let's look at 5. Accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel or to the alleged priorities of Jews worldwide than to the interests of their own nations. Of course, this is an old, long-standing anti-Semitic trope, right? Cosmopolitan Jews, no tie to any nation, and so on. And one, must be sensitive to these kinds of often conspiratorial claims. That's, on the face of it, reasonable. However, I think it's not unreasonable, for example, for Mearsheimer and Walt to take on the Israel lobby, and from a realist perspective, which focuses on states as rational actors that pursue their national interest, to say, is it really in the United States' national interest to assist, to aid, to arm a state that is engaging in this occupation, to maintaining and sustaining this occupation? This is a legitimate inquiry from the perspective of realism in international relations, right? This should not be closed down, especially when you go to AIPAC's website, where they crow about how they support pro-Israel legislators, and they take down those who are more skeptical that pursuing a close relationship with Israel is in the national interests of the United States. They say this openly, right? This should be open to discussion, but according to this definition, it is apparently anti-Semitic. 6, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, e.g. by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor, applying double standards by requiring of it behavior not expected or demanded by any other democratic nation. I mean, not to engage in genocidal action is a pretty reasonable demand of a democratic nation, I think, no? But I think what's crucial here is it seems to suggest that these two things are mutually exclusive, right? That a right to self-determination, in a way, can, by its very nature, or at least maybe applied to the Jewish people, is exclusive of, or not in any kind of homology with racism, right? Not in any kind of, let's say, connection to racism. But if you look at the origin of the United States, if you look at the origin of this country, if you look at the origin of Australia, if you look at the justification for Boer national self-determination in South Africa, is grounded in what can only be understood as racist projects. So why are we prevented from discussing this in the context of Israel? I mean, I don't think it stands up. So I think the notion that, more so the idea that we are, I think the other point is 8, drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. I think this is another very contentious point. That is to say, the shutting down of this as an inquiry within an academic context and within the public sphere. And this for a couple of reasons. You have today, I think it was today or yesterday, Gideon Levi asked the question about what would Israel's response be if the United States gave an explicit or an implicit go-ahead for death camps in Gaza, right? Well, does that evoke Nazi Germany? Maybe it does, but this is not a completely implausible development, is it? Levy certainly doesn't think it's implausible. So these discussions have to happen, and as do those about getting back to the point about national self-determination, which I just wanted to make this additional point, that German historians have shown the way in which the Nazis, Hitler in particular, were taken by the westward expansion of the US Republic, right, which was genocidal at the very heart of the settler colonial project. They were influenced and, you could even say, inspired by it. And that went into their notion of Lebensraum, right? Taking the land to the east and enslaving the Slavic peoples, right? So I think that we have this example of the establishment of a greater Israel. Can we not discuss it in terms of other settler colonial projects? Well, we must be able to without being called anti-Semitic. I think this is a legitimate area of inquiry. So the last section, well, the penultimate section of my talk is just to talk a little bit about the closure of the Van City Office for Community Engagement, which has just left so many of us in the SFU community just reeling. We just cannot believe that such a successful public-facing unit has been closed down. This is a unit that has always run a surplus. It's been very well managed. It's established really meaningful connections to the community, to the downtown east side, to one of the most challenged communities all of Canada. at a time when community building is more important now than it has ever been, because fascism thrives when people are isolated, right? When they're lonely, where they don't have community, where they don't have support. So this was, and I thank Sid for sending me these posters. This film screening, which was supported by a number of organizations, including our stamp isn't there, but the Institute, I think, co-sponsored this with the Van City Office for Community Engagement. This took place a year ago, right, Sid? Over a year ago, so last January. So this is the kind of thing that the Van City Office has supported consistently. It has really taken to heart the idea of EDI, which is equity, diversity, inclusion, as people know, right? Most institutions use it as a marketing and as public relations. And I would say my institution, SFU, perhaps more than most, right? But this is one unit that actually did it and did it very well. But that also includes Palestinian programming. Talk about, at this moment, the most excluded community, right? So this is the kind of thing they would do. And this is another one, co-organized, most importantly, I think, with independent Jewish voices. Solidarity is a political version of love. And this is about anti-Zionist Jewish organizing. And I think that nothing rankles more than anti-Zionist Jews, because then it's much more difficult to say they're racist, they're anti-Semites, right? So they must be what? It's self-hating, psychotic, something like this. Right? And the person who attacked us for the photo exhibition, I said, well, but you know, we're working with the independent Jewish voices. She said, oh, they're not Jews. I said, excuse me? What? And who gets to determine that? And what does that mean anyway? Really? And so. This is something that I've been writing about quite a bit, which is identity politics. And identity politics has this dimension to it, which is violent at the end of the day. That if you are subsumable beneath a particular identity, you are forced to, in a way, toe a certain line. Otherwise, you're violently excluded. So you're subordinated within the group, and if you don't fully toe the line, then you at some point you can be violently excluded. Right, and this is, I think, at the heart of this orgy that we've seen over the last 15, 20 years of cancellation and deplatforming and so on. So we really have to get our heads around that, and I'll come to that in my conclusions. But so I want to say that given the securitization that I alluded to earlier, securitization in response to supposed lapses in safety, we have also the fact that in September, much to the chagrin and protest of SWUFA, and in particular Faculty for Palestine, of which I'm a member, the senior administration of the university met with the Israeli ambassador and discussed areas of mutual interest, innovation, tech, and so on. They didn't really come to any agreements on anything. No, at this stage, there's nothing that's been agreed to, no MOUs established or what have you. We don't exactly know what was said, so I'll just leave that there. They met in September. There were these events that were organized, and then January 23rd, there was a notice that the Vancouver Office for Community Engagement was being shuttered. The university wants to focus on its key academic mission, core academic mission. But this is a university, as people will most likely know, whose mission is engaging the world. And this was a key unit that was doing that. So it raises questions about why and the timing. I'm not going to draw any conclusions. I'll leave it to you to think about. But I do wonder. It's not a good look. It's not a good look at all. Especially since the way it happened was quite brutal. So within about 6 hours or so, 12 hours of the termination and closure. So people are being terminated and the office is being closed. Within about 12 hours, the website was taken down. And the provost's announcement about the closure was put in its place. There was an immediate protest that we need these resources for teaching. Teaching is a core mission, I think, of the university, isn't it? I mean, right?
Once.
It maybe once was, yeah. So that was interesting. It was put back up. And for this talk, I wanted to look at some of the previous events and, get some posts. That's why I talked to Sid, because I would have really liked to have just gone to the Vancity office's website and just looked at the previous. It's all gone. It's like it's just been wiped. So I think this is a very, very worrying development. And just on this topic, and I'll be finishing in a couple of minutes. But there is going to be a teach-in tomorrow, all day tomorrow. So if people can come by, show their support for even an hour or two, it would be great. So it starts at 10, I think goes to 9 or something. It's a big program, films and discussions and dance and all kinds of things. All the sorts of things that the Vancity office did. It was programming for your mind, for your heart, for your soul, everything. And there was a very concerted and successful attempt to bring in Indigenous communities to play a key role. But this is all, it's gone now. Right? So what are some of the conclusions here? So something that I've been arguing for a long time, and in fact, I was worried already in the early 90s as a graduate student in Ontario, where there was being floated the idea that classrooms in high schools, but I think also there was some suggestion this might go into the universities as well, and it became a bit more difficult because of this pesky thing called academic freedom, that there should be zero tolerance for offensive speech. Well, how the hell are you going to teach politics if nobody gets offended by at least something? You can't do it. You just can't do it. And I thought about this question then. I thought, well, how do you teach the question of Palestine if nobody's going to get offended? So I've always been worried about this, and I've always hammered this point that we need a principled defense of freedom of expression and academic freedom, a principled one, meaning academic freedom and freedom of expression for me and my friends is all very well and good, and Noam Chomsky makes this point brilliantly. But it's not really academic freedom or freedom of expression. It only becomes substantive when it's for those with whom you disagree, and often quite strongly, to put it mildly. We have to be able to tolerate views that we disagree with, and we can't have recourse to the idea that this is offensive and therefore it harms me. It harms me, it does me violence. There's a specific reason for that. I'm going to come to that in a second. So the discourse of safety can be extremely unsafe. So this is my second point, as you can see. So we ought to think twice about it, completely. And as a side point, because safety is often done in this sense of inclusion and equity and diversity, we should always be highly skeptical, doubtful when institutions say that they're committed to EDI. We should be doubtful that they actually mean it. It's usually just, I've seen it so many times. It is marketing. It's PR. And it is that which opens the gate for securitization. Third point, I think this is a more, let's say, theoretical point, philosophical point, that the history of civilization, such as it is, okay, I'm not using it as a kind of normative view, but the history of civilization as a process has been based on what I'd call the increasing sublimation of violence into discourse, politics, law, and institutions, right? These things are really war by other means. That's important because the violence is still stored up. It's not explicit, it's not manifest, but it's latent. But better have a latent violence in politics than an open violence in war, in civil war. I think we can agree, especially at a time where this becomes more and more of an open possibility. So we have the substitution of actual force. So the substitution of the unforced force of better argument for force. And I think this is really important. That means the progressive curtailment, just 30 seconds, the progressive curtailment of freedom of expression amounts, therefore, to the de-sublimation of violence, the unleashing of violence, the return of violence, or the making manifest of a latent violence, and points us in the direction of a kind of war of all against all. Right? Finally, if people are denied the opportunity for discourse, they have no other recourse than violence. Therefore, measures like IHRA, protocols like it, will simply betray their own stated intentions. There's no reason to come from outside and say, oh, this is problematic for all these reasons. You say this is going to reduce harm and violence against the Jewish community, but in fact, when you're closing down discourse, it's not going to end well, I think. And that's a historical example. It's not something that I'm threatening. I'm saying this is history, right? It's a de-sublimation of violence. That's what it is. Thanks very much. I think I'm right at my time. Thanks for your attention. Yes. Oh, we're gonna have an interview.
Can we just go through?
Sure. Okay.
Can we just how is everyone feeling? Like, I know I promised a break, but can we change our minds? Are you okay if we go straight into Dr. Coulter's presentation? Is everyone okay with that? Okay.
All right.
The floor is yours.
Well, I would like to thank Amnesty International for inviting us, and Tajida as well for moderating tonight. And thank you so much for your incredibly insightful remarks. It's often said, by way of comfort in bleak times, that the truth always prevails. But in his classic 1859 treatise, the British philosopher John Stuart Mill firmly rejected what he called, quote, the idle sentimentality that truth, merely as truth, has any inherent power denied to error of prevailing against the dungeon and the stake. It's simply not true, Mill said, that the truth always prevails. And in fact, men and women are not more zealous, not any more enthusiastic for truth than they often are for error. Your Zionist opponents are just as enthusiastic, just as zealous for their error than you are for the truth. And if the majority applies enough social pressure, if it applies enough legal penalties against a truthful minority, the majority will very often succeed in suppressing the truth and stopping its spread. In other words, the dungeon and the stake do often prevail over the truth. If truth does have a single advantage over error, Mill says, it consists in this. I'll quote him again, that when an opinion is true, it may be extinguished once, it may be extinguished twice or many times, but in the course of ages, there will generally be found persons to rediscover it, until some of its reappearances fall on a time where, from favorable circumstances, it escapes persecution until it has made such a head as to withstand all subsequent attempts to suppress it. So in other words, you can beat down, you can trammel upon, and you can suppress unwanted truths for a generation, perhaps even for many. But because truth is truth, it has this enduring quality. Eventually, people will find it and they'll believe in it again, and again, and again, and again, until a time comes where the truth escapes persecution. It makes such a head, gains such widespread acceptance, that at long last, it proves impossible to suppress it any longer. Once the truth is out, it's out. If that's all a little bit too abstract, we could consider, for example, the truth about slavery from the days of Spartacus during the Roman Empire. There were those who recognized the truth that slavery was a wicked and perverse institution. And from the days of Spartacus, that truth was suppressed time and time again. It wasn't until, of course, the 19th century that the truth got out. It resulted in the abolition of slavery across the British Empire and subsequently most of the world. So what exactly does this have to do with Palestine? Well, whenever I read Mill's reflections in On Liberty about the role truth plays in the struggle for justice, my mind moves to the people of Palestine and their long denied demand for elementary human rights and dignity. For over a century, the truth about the Palestinians has been largely suppressed in the Western world, including, of course, in this country. And yet, I submit that in Canada today, Israel and its apologists fear that the truth about the Palestinian cause, too, has finally gained such favorable circumstances and made such head that it is, as Mill would have put it, now beyond all attempts to suppress it. I know, of course, that that's cold comfort for the tortured people of Gaza. There's no silver lining, none at all, to the genocide, of course, that Israel has perpetrated over the past 16 months. The truth, it seems, has arrived too late for Gaza. Long before the Hamas attacks on October 7th, 2023, Gaza was described by Haaretz, Israel's leading newspaper, as a ghetto, by the International Committee of the Red Cross as a sinking ship, and by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, a toxic slum. But after the past year, Gaza is now something much worse. Israel's reduced the Strip, in the words of the UN Special Rapporteur for the Occupied Palestinian Territories, Francesca Albanese, to, quote, a wasteland of rubble and human remains, with people barely holding on to life amid deprivation and disease while battling with deep inherited trauma. Politically, socially, culturally, and as we all know, physically, Gaza is scarcely a memory. There's very little left there. Not only has Israel killed at least 61,000 men, women, and children, but 92% of the homes in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed. The United Nations estimates that it would take 15 years just to clear the rubble that now litters Gaza, 50 million tons of it. Of course, all of us with a conscience welcome the ceasefire that was concluded this January, but for those now languishing in Gaza's howling wasteland, there's no certainty that this quote-unquote relative calm is going to be sustainable, no realistic prospect that Israel is going to allow the reconstruction of their homes and their lives, and above all else, little rational hope for an imminent resolution to the festering Palestine question, which has now broken out again into an open wound. In short, if we're honest, the outlook is exceedingly bleak. Indeed, Israel's image has degraded in the eyes of Canadian public opinion, but it remains unlikely that this is going to fundamentally alter Western policy and support for Israeli crimes in the short or medium term. After all, that policy is made in Washington, not Ottawa. Still, those of us acting in solidarity with the Palestinian people, those of us here at this event, have no choice but to seize on every opportunity we have, however slender, to forward the cause of justice and human rights in Palestine. And to that end, I'm going to say a few words first about Canada's historical complicity in suppressing the truth about the Palestinian cause, then about how the landscape of Canadian public opinion has shifted dramatically for the better, and third, about why a demand for free speech and expression is essential to any movement committed not just to Palestinian, but human rights in general. Achieving justice in Palestine, I argue, and Samir, I'm sure, completely agrees with me, demands that we pair two slogans. Free Gaza, yes, but also free speech. So, how did the truth come to find fertile ground here in Canada? It certainly wasn't there in 1948, the year that 750,000 Palestinians were systematically expelled from their homes to make way for the nascent state of Israel, what Palestinians, of course, appropriately call the Nakba, or the catastrophe. In 1967, as we all know, Israel militarily conquered and established a brutal occupation in the remainder of Palestine. And Amnesty International has aptly summarized the nature of this occupation in its landmark 2024 report. It's wrote, quote, Israel has established and maintained an institutionalized regime of oppression and domination of the Palestinian population for the benefit of Jewish Israelis, wherever it has exercised control over the Palestinians and their lives since 1948. And yet, that Palestinian cause met with very little sympathy in the quote-unquote true North strong and free. And the factors of this, of course, are well known to historians and analysts alike. First and most significantly, Canada's role as a junior partner, first to Britain and then to Washington, both of which regarded the Palestine region and the state of Israel as a key strategic asset in a oil-rich region of the globe. Secondly, of course, the domestic Israel lobby, both in its Christian Zionist and Jewish formations, which, on the rare occasion that Canadian foreign policy begins to deviate from its almost uniformly pro-Israel line, flies into action to push it back into place. And then third, and I think most intangibly, but still very significantly, just crass settler colonial solidarity. The state of Israel, of course, sought for decades to suppress the truth about what had happened to the Palestinians in 1948. But I think the sad reality is that in Canada, it hardly need have bothered. Richard Crossman, a British MP who was part of a very important investigative commission to Palestine in 1946, speaking about the United States, but it applies equally to Canada, said the following, right? He spelt out this relationship. Zionism, after all, is merely the attempt by the European Jew to build his national life on the soil of Palestine, in much the way as the American settler or the Canadian settler developed the West. So, the Canadian will give the Jewish settler in Palestine the benefit of the doubt and regard the Arab as the aboriginal who must go down before the march of progress. So, in other words, Canada was willing to accept dispossession and displacement in Palestine for the simple reason that we'd done it here first. For those of us who have read Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman's classic work, Manufacturing Consent, we know that even in liberal democratic countries, mass media is heavily incentivized to shape public opinion in the interests of power. And Canada is, of course, no exception. The media played its role very dutifully. And it's no surprise then that historically, most Canadians nodded along to a narrative that was as simple as it was singular. The state of Israel, a peace-loving Canadian ally, a liberal democracy, a bastion of liberal democracy in the Middle East, and a pioneer state. The Palestinians, to the extent that their existence was acknowledged, either miserly refugees or menacing terrorists. Let's fast forward then to today. 2025. Israel's modus operandi, as we all know, towards the Palestinians remains fundamentally unchanged. In the aftermath of the Hamas assault and massacre on October 7th, Israeli society very quickly rallied around the solution first employed in 48, Nakba 2.0. The cry went up across the Israeli political spectrum, the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians from Gaza via genocidal force. And as many in the ensuing months noted, the media images of streams of Palestinian refugees desperately fleeing Israeli bombardment eerily recalled that 1948 exodus. As far as Israeli policy towards the Palestinians was concerned, it seemed that there was nothing new under the sun. What was new, however, is how Canadians reacted to this genocidal Israeli campaign. To be sure, if we look at official Canadian policy, it remained to a large extent guided by the factors I just mentioned. Our status as a junior partner to Washington, the Israel lobby, settler colonial solidarity. And the record of Justin Trudeau's Liberal government over the past year is no doubt a travesty. Subject to domestic political pressure, Canada marginally began to realign itself with the international consensus on the Palestine question. In December of 2023, for example, the Trudeau government for the first time voted alongside the rest of the world in favor of a ceasefire resolution. And in March 2024, our parliament did pass legislation calling upon the government to, quote, cease the further authorization and transfer of arms exports to Israel. But at the very same time, Trudeau's Liberals took steps to maintain our complicity in the genocide. Even as Canada put a pause on new arms exports, to the state of Israel. We continue to fulfill old arms exports, totaling millions of dollars in military technology and hardware. As Michael Buchert, the head of a well-known organization, Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, noted, he said, there's every reason to believe that many of these weapons Canada has been supplying have been used in the genocidal campaign in Gaza. Calls by Amnesty International, other conscientious human rights organizations for a two-way arms embargo were roundly ignored. And meanwhile, on the diplomatic front, our government has routinely objected to the investigation of Israeli crimes, either by UN investigative bodies or by UN judicial bodies like the International Court of Justice. It refused to accept, for example, the International Court of Justice's January 2024 determination that Israel was plausibly committing genocide in Gaza. And yet, at the level of Canadian public opinion, a dramatic shift has taken place. The Liberal government, of course, sugarcoats its complicity with Israeli genocide with the language of platitudinal support for Palestinian human rights, for international law, and for a peaceful settlement, perhaps somewhere in the infinitely far-flung future. But for many Canadians today, those terms, international law, human rights, peaceful settlement of disputes, those are not just words, those are sacred values, they're principles. And these Canadians have found it increasingly difficult, moreover, to reconcile those sacred principles with Israel's evangelical dedication to mass slaughter and ethnic cleansing. Now, a brief look at the polling data, I think, is really instructive here. In May of 2024, when the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for not just Hamas leaders, but also Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, along with the defense minister at the time, Yoav Gallant. In May of 24, polls showed that over half of all Canadians agreed that Netanyahu and Gallant either absolutely or probably should be tried for war crimes. Just a month later, a poll by the influential and respected polling agency, Agnes Reid, found that over 55% of Canadians expressed a negative view of the state of Israel. Just 29% held a positive view. And most shocking of all, at least to me, was that same month, a poll found that 45% of Canadians agreed with the statement, quote, that Israel is committing genocide in the Gaza Strip. Less than a quarter disagreed. It's hard to overstate, I think, the significance of that shift. I'm still a fairly young person, I think, but I have dedicated now a decade of my life, since about 2014, to supporting the Palestinian cause, both as an academic and as an activist. And if you had told me in my undergraduate days at the University of the Fraser Valley that 45% of Canadians would agree within a little over a decade that the Israelis were guilty of committing genocide against the Palestinians, I probably would have looked at you like you were a lunatic. Completely impossible, unimaginable. So we can let that sink in for a moment. Nearly half the country believes that Israel is committing not just crimes against humanities, but the crime of crimes, a genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza. I think it's relatively safe to say that for a large portion of the Canadian public, that image of Israel as a pioneer state, a liberal democracy in the Middle East, administering an essentially benign occupation over the Palestinian people, that image is gone, and it's unlikely to come back anytime soon. Of course, this shift didn't occur overnight. Rather, it's the result of several significant developments over the past 2 decades, which allowed the truth about Palestine to finally gain a foothold in Canadian public opinion and to make enough head as to thrust Israel towards ever deeper international pride. I'm just going to point to 3 factors here. The first is what was happening on the ground starting in the 1990s and then escalating into the 2000s, the rise and then collapse of the Oslo peace process. Now, for those decades, the 1990s into the 2000s, Canadians in general tolerated Israel's occupation of Gaza and the West Bank because it was presumed to be temporary. We were told, many of us believed, that Israel's expansion of settlements, right, its systematic torture of Palestinian prisoners, its resorts to extrajudicial executions, its drone strikes, and so on, these were ugly policies, but they were going to terminate soon. There was going to be a negotiated resolution to the conflict. There'd be the establishment of a Palestinian state alongside the state of Israel. But by the year 2010, that Oslo peace process had been exposed as essentially fraudulent. It wasn't a peace process, it was an annexation process. Israel continually accruing to itself more and more Palestinian land under the guise of negotiations. And by the middle part of the 2010s, the veil began to lift, and the reality of what Israel is had begun to impress itself upon international, including Western audiences. Israel today is not a country with a regular political spectrum. I'm sure many of you have realized this. You have what's called a left, and then a center, and then a right. And that entire political spectrum, with the exception of literally a number of people that you could count on one hand, right? That entire political spectrum has been dedicated now for well over a decade to a single shared objective: maintaining indefinitely Israel's regime of supremacy over the Palestinian people. Long before the 7th of October, Israeli officials, not just in Netanyahu's government, but also the official opposition, virtually every party in the Knesset, openly and loudly declared their opposition to any form of Palestinian self-determination and statehood within the territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. And furthermore, that same Israeli political spectrum was united around Israel's increasingly violent military operations directed against the Gaza Strip in the same period. When in 2008 and 2009, Israel launched what Amnesty International called 22 days of death and destruction against the Palestinians in Gaza, what it called Operation Cast Lead, a well-known Israeli journalist, I think Samir already mentioned him, Gideon Levy, he very famously wrote that this time we went too far, that Israel had overstepped its bounds, and that it was now going to pay some international consequences. But I think arguably it can be said that he was wrong. In 2014, Israel showed that it was not deterred in the slightest by international condemnation. It launched another operation, Protective Edge, this time killing some 2,400 Palestinians, including 500 children. And in 2018, when Palestinians in Gaza launched an overwhelmingly nonviolent set of protests at the Gaza prison fence, and Israeli snipers systematically gunned down those Palestinian protesters, well over 90% of Israel's Jewish population declared that the IDF was using, quote unquote, the right amount or not enough force against those protesters. So that's factor one, the collapse of the peace process and the exposure of what Israel was. Secondly, and of course relatedly, the essential work of human rights organizations in exposing Israeli crimes. For the decades prior to the collapse of the peace process, human rights organizations had typically analyzed, documented, and condemned particular Israeli atrocities and crimes against the Palestinian people. Its illegal land theft, for example, or its torture of Palestinian detainees. But it still continued to treat the occupation itself as an essentially acceptable because temporary state of affairs. When the peace process disintegrated, however, that illusion was no longer possible to keep up, and human rights organizations organizations began to pivot towards criticizing the Israeli regime between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River as a whole. The first human rights organization to do this was Israel's own respected human rights organization, B'Tselem, which in 2020 put out a 20-page position paper boldly entitled "A Regime of Jewish Supremacy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. This is Apartheid." And then later in 2021, that claim was fleshed out in a 213-page report by Human Rights Watch, to be followed by Amnesty International, which painstakingly demonstrated the truthfulness of that allegation in a whopping 280-page report. Now, the reality is, however, that as useful as these reports are, it's very easy to see that Israel's an apartheid state just by spending 5 minutes on the ground there, or by looking for a few minutes at the situation that prevails there. The argument that Israel's an apartheid state is very, very simple. It is the argument that says, if you control 6-7 million people within a single territory and deny them civil rights within your own state, while at the same time denying them sovereignty within their state, you're an apartheid state. You're planning to interminably keep a people suppressed and subjugated. And in 2024, just this year, the International Court of Justice confirmed the judgment of these human rights organizations when it concluded in an advisory opinion that, yes, Israel was indeed guilty of committing the crime of apartheid. A third, and I think most crucially, we have to refer to the activist movement on the ground here in Canada, which played the essential role in drawing the public's attention to the previous two developments. Today, more than any point in Canadian history, there exists a robust and diverse set of organizations advocating across this country for Palestinian rights at both the popular and the political level. And the impact of these developments on Canadian public opinion was already beginning to show prior to October 7th. So by September of 2023, fully 38% of Canadians believed that Israel was an apartheid state, including almost half of Canadians under the age of 34. That was quite an accomplishment. And when after October 7th, Israel began to wage a war of destruction against the Palestinian people in Gaza, that movement very quickly mobilized, flew into action, and engaged not only in mass protests, the encampments, and so on, but also, I think, in a very effective educational campaign aimed at exposing Canadians to the historical lineage of the crimes that were being committed before their eyes. In other words, the truth. If Canadians subsequently proved to be so critical of Israel's conduct in Gaza, this was, I think, in significant part due to all of that hard work that had been invested in the cause in the decades preceding. Simply put, Canadians now knew too much. And the lesson, I think, to be pulled from this is that everything Samir said in his talk was absolutely correct. The movement for justice in Palestine, it shouldn't try to flee or flout the truth. We shouldn't try to cancel views we don't like. We shouldn't try to shut down the debate. Rather, the truth is our greatest weapon. The truth and justice are twin principles. They don't contradict. And if our ends are only as good as the means by which we pursue them, we can't suppress one of those principles in the service of another. The movement for justice in Palestine should welcome open debate, not just because the power to suppress speech is not available to us in the way that it's available to supporters of the State of Israel, but because the truth, the facts, are on our side. Simply put, if free-flowing debate is going to be permitted, and if we've put in the hard work to educate ourselves, to prepare ourselves, then when we enter into that quote-unquote battlefield of ideas, we can and we do win. We win that battle. Just consider for a moment every major evidentiary question that has been subjected to public debate regarding Israel's conduct in Gaza over the last year. Is Israel guilty of intentionally starving the Palestinian people in Gaza? Is Israel guilty of intentionally targeting Palestinian civilians, Palestinian aid workers, Palestinian journalists for death? Is Israel guilty of systematically torturing Palestinian detainees as a matter of its policy? It's no exaggeration, I think, to say that on each and every one of those crucial questions, the evidentiary balance looks something like this. Us in this room, we can gesture to the findings of every UN agency. We can point to the findings of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, the UN Commission of Inquiry to the Occupied Palestinian Territories, the UN Special Rapporteur for the Occupied Palestinian Territories, UNICEF, the UN International Children's Emergency Fund. We can also point to every humanitarian agency working on the ground in Gaza, Save the Children, Oxfam, Doctors Without Borders, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and we can draw upon the findings of every reputable human rights organization monitoring the situation in Gaza. Amnesty and its partners, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, and so on. With virtually zero exceptions, these organizations affirm Israeli culpability on all of those questions I just posed. What about the other side? What can defenders of the State of Israel refer to when they make their case? Well, not because they want to, but because they have no other choice. They have to refer almost exclusively to the claims of the State of Israel and its proxies. That is almost literally true. If you look, for example, at the International Court of Justice submissions, the South African submission was well over 80 pages, hundreds and hundreds of footnotes, all to the organizations I just mentioned. The Israeli defense cited none of those organizations I just mentioned, I think with maybe just one exception, and almost entirely cited self-referenced claims. So all we have to do as conscientious activists is ask Canadians, who do you believe? Who do you believe? Are all of those organizations Hamas proxies? Are they all anti-Semitic? When that choice is put, I think, to most Canadians, they recognize very quickly it's not really a choice at all. If you take a step further and you actually explain to Canadians the detailed findings of these organizations, the facts practically speak for themselves. So let's focus for a moment, just by way of example, on the Israeli bombing campaign, which was particularly fierce in the first few months of the genocide in Gaza, and was responsible for the large majority of Palestinian deaths. On the one hand, critics of Israel, like Amnesty International, claim that Israel waged a totally indiscriminate bombing campaign that was essentially genocidal in nature. And then on the other hand, we have Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who assures us that the IDF set a record not just for the most discriminate and proportional war in the 21st century, but the most discriminate and proportionate war in human history. So who's right? Let's turn to a single data point. The December 2024 findings of a London-based organization, Air Wars. The report is called Patterns of Harm. I highly recommend you look at it. It's only 20 or 30 pages. It has very neat charts. And that report essentially investigated over 600 Israeli airstrikes during the first month of Israel's assault on Gaza, October 2023, which killed well over 5,000 Palestinians. And Air Wars found that Benjamin Netanyahu is right in one way. Israel did set quite a few records. It found, for example, and I'll just list them here, that the most conservative figure for civilians killed in Gaza is nearly 4 times the number of civilians killed in the most lethal month previously documented by Air Wars. That proportionately, children make up a significantly higher number of those killed in Gaza compared to any other conflict documented by Air Wars. that more women were killed per incident on average than any other conflict documented by air wars, that Palestinian families were killed together in unprecedented numbers and in their homes, that the number of journalists killed in Gaza just in those 25 days is roughly equivalent to the average number of media workers killed in conflict settings globally per year over the 30 years prior to October 2023. That there are inclinations that the IDF's declared rate of weapons use exceeded that of any modern air power, and that the intensity of strikes and civilian harm in Gaza during that month was unprecedented by modern historical standards. Is there an argument to be had here? Sure, you can quibble if you'd like over legal technicalities, right? Does the death and destruction described by air wars rise to the level of genocide as defined under the formal 1948 convention? Or did Israel merely commit crimes against humanity and mass murder? That's perhaps an area where reasonable people can disagree and debate. But the fundamental picture, I think, is crystal clear. You can slice and dice the facts and figures I just presented any way you want, and you can't avoid the same ineluctable conclusion. Since the 7th of October 2023, the State of Israel, as a matter of policy, waged a war of mass slaughter against the Palestinians in Gaza. That's not an opinion. It's not up for discussion because it's a fact. It's the truth. And the moment Canadians recognize that truth, I think the game is pretty much up for Israeli supporters in this country. So it's no wonder then that in the face of this surfeit of free speech, apologists for the State of Israel have sharply pivoted away from entering the fora of reason debate. I think Samir spoke really excellently to that topic, right? If you can't win the debate on even terms, it's always better to just shut it down altogether. And that explains why, in Canada, the result has been a widespread and relatively coordinated attack on free speech at virtually every level of our society. It's why there was such immense pressure put on universities to forcibly dismantle those encampments. It's why there was immense pressure put on universities to shut down events, much like this one, on university campuses. It's why, in complete contradiction with the right to free speech, events were shut down on the basis of the argument that it was making students or Jewish students feel unwelcome or unsafe. It's why the IHRA definition was employed in order to try and accuse anyone who raises questions about the State of Israel and its settler colonial project, to accuse them of being motivated by anti-Semitism or Jew hatred. To be certain, this doesn't quite rise to the level of the dungeon and the stake, but its intent is, and its objective is the same, right? To put a chilling effect on free speech about this topic in Canada, and to intimidate ordinary Canadians who might otherwise be willing to speak up and join the conversation, to intimidate them into silence. So this is ultimately why I also think it's so essential to pair the global campaign for Palestinian rights with a principled, again, with Samir, principled insistence on fundamental free speech rights. In Canada today, the movement for justice in Palestine, which in its current incarnation has become an anti-genocide movement, it does not have a great deal of institutional power. It does not have the fundraising apparatus of the Israel lobby. It garners very little support from the Canadian political establishment. And what power it does have derives from its ability to reach and influence the ordinary Canadian public and to mobilize that public on the ground. So I'll say again, in my view, truth is the movement's greatest, its most indispensable weapon. So I'm going to conclude now, but to some of you, I know that what I just said may have come across somewhat deflating. Because after all, didn't I just start my short talk here by stating that the truth doesn't always prevail, and that the truth may have come too late for Gaza, and that there's few reasonable prospects for the people there? Why fight for the truth, you might ask, this abstract ideal, when practically speaking, it seems a little futile? Well, I've talked about this with many of my colleagues. One of my esteemed colleagues said the following, and I'm going to repeat the essence of it here because I agree with it completely. I think first, we continue to struggle because if we do nothing, the situation doesn't stay static, right? If we do nothing, the situation in Gaza will get worse. What limits were put on Israel over the past 16 months were placed there by Washington, and what limits Washington placed on Israel over the past 16 months were essentially concessions to popular public opinion. I think that if the level of activism that was sustained over that time period hadn't been there, Israeli crimes in Gaza would have been all the more egregious. Now, secondly, I think it's a fundamental part of human nature, at least amongst those of us who are conscientious, that you can't stand by and do nothing. That even if you know a cause might not succeed, that it might be futile, that it's worth struggling on all the same. And third and finally, I would say that we should continue to struggle for the truth about Palestine because the analysis I gave at the beginning of this talk might be wrong. Indeed, we should struggle because history is highly contingent. It's chock full of surprises. And nobody has a monopoly on truth. In 1950, for example, if you had asked the average global citizen whether there was any hope that the people of Algeria would be able to liberate themselves from French occupation and colonization, I think the vast majority of people would have said impossible. In the 1970s, in a struggle that has basically been forgotten, but in the 1970s, the state of Indonesia invaded East Timor. And in 1976, in private correspondence, because he didn't want to say it publicly, but in 1976, the UN Secretary General at the time, Kurt Waldheim, he wrote that essentially the cause of East Timor was a lost cause, that essentially it was going to be colonized by Indonesia and become a permanent part of the Indonesian state. He was wrong. After decades of struggle, including struggle within the United States, which was supporting the Indonesian government against the policies of the US, including within Canada, because Canada too was complicit in that crime. After decades of struggle, the Indonesian occupation of East Timor abruptly collapsed, practically without warning, and Indonesia gained independence. So, though at the present moment I wouldn't say that it's probable, and I don't want to hold out false hope, I think it may yet be that the situation in Palestine will surprise us. It may be that opportunities yet exist that we cannot foresee. And it could be that ultimately truth and justice will yet prevail for the Palestinian people in Gaza. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Samir Gandesha and Dr. Coulter Lowers. That was amazing, informative session. We'll take few moments now with the nice, colorful cards that you have. We'll take few moments if you want to write any questions. Please use clear handwriting so I could read it. And there is some water in the back if you need a stretch break, washroom break. Have a couple of minutes.